So welcome everyone to our new webinar. Another very interesting topic tonight. We're going to discuss oppression. We're going to discuss oppressive behavior, colonialism, and a series of patterns and structures that are reflecting in society, in our everyday life, as well as in state policy. I'm really glad we brought this topic. It's quite a new one and a unique one. So I would like just to mention Julia Hodgins. Just would like to say a big thank to you for organizing this, to setting this up, and also to having this idea of bringing this new topic to ITSS Verona. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to organize this with you. So tonight we have a very interesting board of guests coming from all over the world. I would like to introduce you all, but of course, first of all, thank you for being here. Lucia Sarmiento Verano, Rafia Zakaria, Maísa Edwards, Jorge Sanchez-Perez. I hope I didn't mispronounce your names, but welcome to this new webinar at ITSS Verona, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Nice to see you all. So after a brief round of introduction, just to mention some of your work and contributions, I'm gonna leave the word to Julia Hodgins, who's gonna take over as a chair of the event. She's gonna lead the discussion, and then she's also going to lead the Q&A section in the very end of the webinar, where people from the public are going to be able to ask questions and interact with the guests. Again, our guests tonight research extensively on oppression and the colonial patterns and state policy as well. So we are going to delve into it later, but please stay until the end because it's going to be a very interactive and interesting debate. So starting from Lucia, welcome. Lucia, she's a humanistic therapist. She is working both online and in Oxfordshire as well. And exciting news, she's starting her Ph.D. soon, this coming autumn, at the University of Birkebek, if I'm pronouncing it right. And she's going to delve into psychosocial studies. Her research interests revolve around Eurocentrism, colonial studies, and she also conducted some very interesting research on Mestizo communities in the Andean region. So welcome, Lucia.
Thank you.
And moving on to Rafia Zakaria. She's a columnist, a published author, and a researcher as well. She's writing for The Dawn in Pakistan and The Baffler. And she also worked for Amnesty International between 2009 and 2015. And she published two very interesting books. I will say the title is already hinting to the topic, very interesting one. And I'm going to later on share a slide so that you can take note and perhaps decide to read her books later. One of the two was written in 2015, The Upstairs Wife, An Intimate History of Pakistan. And the second one was recently published in 2021. Against White Feminism. Welcome, Rafia. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you.
And then moving on to the next guest, Maísa Edwards. Thank you for being here. She is about to complete her PhD in International Relations in a joint program between the University of Sao Paulo and King's College London. And her research interests revolve around Brazil foreign policy, Brazil defense, maritime security, and her PhD thesis was presented in the UK, in Brazil, as well as in countries like Germany and Belgium. We are going to hear more about it later. Welcome, Maísa. And then last but not least, Jorge Sanchez-Perez. Welcome, and thank you for being with us. From the Department of Philosophy at the University of Alberta in Canada. He is currently conducting a very, very interesting research that is at the intersection of Western philosophy and indigenous philosophy. And in particular, is currently trying to develop methodological tools to allow Western philosophy to engage with indigenous thinking. And just like Lucia, he also researched on communities in the Andean region and their thinking as well. So welcome and thank you for being here. And then, of course, I will not forget about Julia Hodgins, our one of the oldest members of ITSS Verona and one of the dearest one as well. She's a deputy of research at ITSS, a beautiful researcher, I can add, since I was lucky enough to study with her at King's College London. And she studied sociology in her bachelor at the University of Fraser Valley. And then she moved into international relations at King's College London, where she completed her master. And currently she is researching about the impact of COVID-19 on the agricultural sector of society in Canada. And the most important information, she currently lives in Vancouver Island with her husband and a very spoiled cat. So welcome, thank you for being with us. Again, thank you for helping me to set this up, having the idea of discussing oppression at ITSS. And I will say now the floor is yours. She's going to conduct the debate and the Q&A section. Before you start, very briefly, I'm gonna do this as well in the end of the webinar as well. But I will do it now for just a couple of seconds. Can you all see it?
Yes.
Okay, so in case you want to reach out to any of our guests or to our chair, Julia, in case you want to check their work, their blogs, their books, you have a full list here going from Lucia, Rafia, her 2 books, Maísa, her Ph.D. thesis, her email, Jorge, his Twitter, his email as well, and Julia. You can take notes now or later in the end of the webinar. This is just to help you if you want to connect with any of our guests or with Julia as well. Stop sharing now. You'll see this later. Okay, back to it. So Julia, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Carlota. Thank you to our wonderful guests. Briefly, I'm going to mention the main objectives of this event. I'm sorry, I was sick last week. To discover and share ways to identify oppression in individual, community, and societal interactions related explicitly to enduring historical patterns that have been incepted via colonialism. We would like to see how to spot them, and also reflect on ways that we can counter and dismantle these hegemonic patterns in a way that is assertively but safely, especially for the people that's more vulnerable. The questions we have selected should invite the reflection from different perspectives. And this is for the sole reason that we want to have a dynamic discussion because of the nature of the colonial lens, which is not monolithical, it's not just closed, it's actually complex, it's multi-layers, it is just as diverse and interwoven as intersectionality is, right? And we want this discussion to transpire that. I'm sorry. So we're going to start with the first question that our panelists, they have it ahead of the time. Individual interactions derive from how they socialize at home, how people socialize at home, kinship, community, schools, and the workplace in a continuum of behavioral models that are historically informed by generally social placement. So wherever we are in society, we behave, right? And we're supposed to fit in that. We're supposed, right? So this last thing manifests through unequal privilege and the flip side, that is the development of vulnerability. From your perspective, please discuss how the oppressive structures that have been set through colonialism inform these interactions today. You can draw from field observations, academic research, insights, and every relevant source that you consider such. And we're gonna go in a alphabetic order, okay? First, Maísa, please.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for having me today as a panelist at this amazing event. And it's a privilege to be with you guys almost this evening. Thankfully, the sun is shining here in London. But so to begin, I would say that one of the most important things that we always need to think about with regard to working towards combating oppression and dismantling a system of colonialism is through education. So as somebody who grew up in London, which is a very multicultural city, but is also the heart of what was an enormous empire the British Empire. One of the things that I believe is very inherent and important in our thinking, or at least it should be to think about how we can push not only for better equality, but also to push for a better and more rounded curriculum at school and also at university. So when it comes to understanding colonial structures and also understanding how to dismantle them, I think this is something that should begin from the early years. You know, I remember at primary school learning about, you know, the Aztecs, but also learning about the Tudors. But maybe I was lucky because I've had conversations with friends who have, you know, gone to other schools in the UK. And if you ask them at 14 what an Aztec was, they probably wouldn't know. So when it comes to thinking about education and dismantling a system of oppression, I feel like when it comes to thinking of how individuals not only move through time and space, it should also come from a system that is developed to allow for a broad and open curriculum, one which fosters tolerance and acceptance, but also which allows for students, no matter their age, no matter their social background, to be able to learn about different cultures and different life experiences. And I think this is where, especially with the UK and a system that we also have, which perhaps is different, of course, in different countries, but we have a very classist system in the UK. I mean, when you have still a monarchy in place, that perpetuates, of course, an aristocracy, a landed gentry, which also means that there are all sorts of different checks and balances that need to be thought of in terms of combating classism in the UK. And that comes, I believe, through education, which should be open, free to all, and in a position where we are able to embrace different cultures and learn from our fellow students and our fellow man and woman or person. So I hope that answers at least part of the question. I'm aware that we only have sort of 2-3 minutes, but I think education is very much at the root of trying to combat oppression and also fight for better acceptance and tolerance across the board. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maísa. And yes, we're going to go in a little discussion before moving to the second question. No worries. And Jorge, please enlighten us.
Thank you very much for the question. Thank you, Maísa, for your thoughts. And I'm 100% behind the idea that education has an important role to play here. But I've been disavowed by the notion that it is going to work sooner rather than later, right? It's let me share an example with you. I grew up basically with stories. Everybody in my family in the north coast of Peru just talks to each other with stories. We tell the stories instead of making the point right away. So bear with me. I know it's not too English, but I beg all of you to bear with me. So I went to give a talk at the University of Ottawa. It was at a conference about constitutional law. And Ottawa, Canada, of course, capital of Canada. And I saw that there was a panel on Indigenous law. I was like, oh, that's great. And I asked the organizers, excuse me, who's the Indigenous speaker here? Like, where can I see the Indigenous people? And, you know, having myself Indigenous background from Peru, what I was told was by the organizers of this constitutional forum in the capital of Canada, a colonial state by excellence, was, oh, if you want to see Indigenous people, you have to go downtown, and they're usually drunk around the market. Organizers, they were lawyers with masters, some of them concluding their PhD programs. And in Canada, we have the practice of giving land acknowledgements to acknowledge that we are in different territories that you know were more often than not given freely. Basically, we're stolen from Indigenous people. Right now, I'm in the land known as Treaty 6 territory. So the practice is to give a land acknowledgement. And everybody stood there and I was like, I acknowledge that we're in the land of Indigenous people, A, B, and C. You said that, and move on. I stood there and I said, you know what? I'm not going to give a land acknowledgement because there's not a single Indigenous person here to listen to it. Right? And when I asked for where could I see Indigenous people to interact with them, I was told they were probably drunk at the market. Of course, everybody in the room was super uncomfortable. So like, these are educated people, extremely educated people, right? Lawyers, philosophers at the top of their field, none of them actually took the time to realize, all right, we're going to have a panel discussing indigenous rights with only white people. So I agree with you. Sorry, this is not meant to be as an engagement right now, like an argument, but I think that education is important, but let's not presume that education is not an elite practice in the world. And elites, even so, if sometimes they are minorities themselves, might forget where they came from. So maybe education alone is not going to do the trick because it's not going to be fast enough. Maybe we need a stronger measurement of, a top-down policy that forces us to engage with this diversity that is already there. It's just not there in the right places. I hope that makes a bit of sense. Thank you.
Indeed, that is true. Before we move to Lucia, I just want to say that in Canada, in this part of the country, some people say the 4 Ds of being indigenous: drunken, dancing, drumming, drunken, and dead. I'm going to leave you with that, and we're going to move to Lucia.
Thank you for that and for the responses so far. I'm just going to get a little bit ahead of myself and just say about education that I do agree that everyone has to have access to it. But I tend to see education, or the education system as it exists today in most countries, as an indoctrination in whiteness. So we need to think about what type of education we're talking about. So that's just to kind of answer to this really interesting conversation already. But I wanted to talk also about, the relation between structural oppression and lower levels of oppression in the sense of interpersonal, group level, and intrapersonal oppression. Because that's my specialty, and I see that every day in my work as a therapist and as someone that researches in psychosocial phenomenon. And I just to start, obviously the system that's been formed for the past centuries places a very specific type of people at the top, right? As this supposed superiority of the white, cisgender, able-bodied, middle-class man, and the white woman with him. And that, I think we need to pair it with the knowledge, the psychological knowledge of how we internalize some things, because a lot of our work as psychologists, therapists, is around that internalization of messages, ideas, beliefs, behaviors, and ways of being and relating to others that we do as we grow up. We get all of those from our communities, our families, our societies, and we need to do that in order to belong, be accepted by the community, and be protected and survive. It's a very natural process, but that also means that we internalize social structures and social hierarchies and all the messages that come with that and all the attitudes, ways of being. And there's a couple of concepts, theories that are very helpful for me to understand this. And one is the social unconscious, not to be mistaken by Jung's collective unconscious, because that's very problematic in many ways. Jung is very problematic, but the social unconscious is a term coined by Earl Hopper, who was sociologist and psychoanalyst. And he talks about constraints, social, cultural, and communicational arrangements that are either we're unaware of them, they exist in us because we reproduce them, but we're unaware of them, because they're either not perceived, or if they are perceived, they're not acknowledged, so they are denied. And if they are acknowledged, they are taken as essential, natural, normal, so a given, and not problematized. So that's, I think, what happens with this hierarchy and with whiteness in general. And the other thinker that is very important for us, I think, to understand all of this is Frantz Fanon, and how he speaks of internalization of oppression by everyone. So the other very important thing I wanted to mention before I finish is whiteness, and that's what people get a little bit uncomfortable, prickly when anyone mentions whiteness or white people. But I see, in this case, I see whiteness as Ruth Frankenberg's definition of a set of a social position, a group of people, but also a set of cultural practices. Just to give you an example of those cultural practices, so focus on individualism, competitions versus cooperation, and a certain set of norms that we think are considered normal. They're normally not named. So ways of feeling and expressing our feelings, what's considered appropriate or not, all of that is kind of unspoken of. And what happens is that everything that is not the white person or whiteness as a set of cultural practice is considered as less than or seen from a deficit perspective in relation to whiteness. And that can be expressed in interpersonal relationships in many very subtle ways, but also systemically. And I think it's important to give an example, just to give an illustration of that from my field, mental health, because that's what I know of. There are more than 132 peer-reviewed journal articles that demonstrate that Black people, for example, when they enter mental health services, they tend to be pathologized, overly pathologized, and diagnosed at a much higher rate with very heavy disorders like psychosis or schizophrenia. And at the same time, as they overly pathologize, they tend to be assigned less quality service or interventions, briefer and less intensive interventions, so not exactly what they need. So we see those pathologizing or problematizing of difference, that's of their way of expressing their distress, and at the same time dehumanization by not giving them the care that they require. So I think it's really important, as well as it's as important to say it from a systemic perspective, but also considering how the psychological and the interpersonal aspect of it can reinforce that too. With all the, I'd say, resistances, psychological barriers that there are for people to actually acknowledge this and address this, because it gets very complicated. So that's me.
Thank you very much. Yes, I remember when I was in Alberta, I was confused with being indigenous, and the hospital I entered needed some treatment, and I was waiting there for 40 minutes. People was walking like I didn't even exist. And I told the nurse, hey, I'm here, I need your help. And she leaned like this and said, but you are not dying. I remember she did this, and oh, wow, that was fantastic. Please, Rafia, share your perspective with us.
First of all, thank you so much, Julia. You've been such a supporter of my work, and I cannot tell you how grateful I am for that. As was mentioned, I wrote a book called Against White Feminism, and it deals with a lot of the topics that I think Lucia was talking about and that have been spoken of. One of them, of course, is the fact, in relation to education, is the fact that so much of epistemology is based on colonially gleaned knowledge, right? So for example, in South Asia, in the Indian subcontinent, one of the first things that the British did when they came and were colonizing the subcontinent was to initiate the census, right? Which is that they wanted to count everybody, and all the India, as you know, was and is a very, very diverse society with many different castes, many different religions, many different languages. And but this sort of counting had not been part of the indigenous system or indigenized system that existed at that time. And a lot of the divisions, the political divisions that exist within South Asia today, including arguably the partition itself of creation of India and Pakistan, the separation, of the subcontinent, was based on the fact that before that, people, they lived with difference, and it was interwoven into their lives. But when this colonial power came and told them that, okay, well, you have this many of this caste and this many of this other caste, so the majority, you are more powerful because there's more of you exactly in these numbers than there are of them. And so much of this sort of idea of existence and the role and power people have in it was based on this epistemology of statistics and census making. And I offer that example because it's examples like that show the enduring oppression and how it continues today. A lot of my work is on critiques of development, for instance, and the continuing effect of large development organizations in the global South continue to focus on this idea of making statistical models that provide certain kinds of solutions, even when the people who are making those models and also carrying out these big development ideas don't speak the language of the people that they are supposedly going to spend, millions of dollars with. The example that I always give that's in my book is of clean stoves in India, which was a multi-million-dollar project by the United Nations, where it was this brilliant idea that they were going to give these clean stoves to women in India, and there would be mass adoption, it was assumed, and this would somehow decrease deforestation, and it would improve pulmonary health, and it was going to make women available for wage labor, and this multi-million-dollar project was a huge failure because there were very basic things about those women's lives, such as the fact that they liked being in control of the hearth of their home, that they liked going searching for little firewood with other women in the village. It was their sort of, time with other women, where they, got emotional support and all sorts of things. And so, when we can, excuse me, sorry, when we think about oppression, we have to consider how epistemology or education, forms of education, are so steeped in colonial influence that, as others have said, they end up perpetuating whiteness, and people start to equivocate being progressive or being forward thinking or being even like modern with acting and behaving and adopting whiteness. And this has ravaged and continues to ravage huge parts of the world. I'm originally from Pakistan, and a lot of what Pakistan is going through right now in terms of both political and financial crises can be traced back to these forms of oppression. So yeah, that's what I've got.
Thank you very much for that. And we are supposed to have a mini discussion and move to the second question, but I want to ask you, my dear panelists, would you prefer to go to the second question and then have a bit of a longer time to discuss? I just have this feeling now, or would you prefer to keep the initial structure.
I would love to say something in relation to what Rafia just said.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I actually teach epistemology. I teach philosophy, right? And one of the main problems in Western epistemology is the Gettier case. It's about skepticism in knowledge, etc., developed in 1963. And people were like, wow, this is a fascinating challenge to Plato's account of knowledge, etc., etc. And then, 1963, it was published. It's a good paper. Don't get me wrong. The same account can be found in Dharmottara's writings, an Indian philosopher from the 8th century, right? So over 1,000 years before, that kind of discussion was already happening in India. Yet we are told that this is a huge breakthrough for the world knowledge, because knowledge at the university levels tend to be white knowledge. If white people didn't know it, it wasn't really knowledge. So the Gettier case was a breakthrough because nobody cared to actually check with Indian scholars about their knowledge. So that actually connects to with what Rafia was saying. Sorry, I just had to say that.
No, I mean, I know exactly what you're saying. I tried for a long time to do comparative philosophy where I was working with Islamic philosophers and and Western philosophers, and trying to show that these traditions actually exist in. I mean, it's rationalism wasn't invented by the West, but the academy is still, for all its supposed acceptance, openness, so unwelcoming to these ideas, or to these ideas that that things did not begin to exist when white people found them or discovered them. It continues to be an extremely difficult area to work in academically and in research. So I actually had to leave the academy and become like an independent scholar, just to be able to do these things or to say these things.
Thank you for that. Just to share this, I went to a conference like a month ago in Denver, the United States, and I was going to talk about indigenous philosophy. And I said, look, I'm going to talk about this issue about indigenous philosophy from Andean thought in comparison to Marxism. And if we can avoid the racist questions of like, but is this really philosophy? How does this actually amount to knowledge? We can get a lot farther. Okay, I have an answer for all those things, but I'm just going to avoid that right now because I don't care. Of course, a couple of white professors stood up and left. And I was like, better, less of a burden, better of a sight. So, sorry.
No, it's fantastic. And it's exactly, you guys are getting maybe in the high level epistemologically or philosophical side, but this is a part of the situation we want to enlighten with this discussion, that all those layers that are implicated, how the education condition the behaviors, right? I heard of a case of a friend here in British Columbia, Vancouver. She worked for a charity, and the president of the board recently became the CEO, which we're talking about a conflict of interest already, but because he's an all-white male working in finance, he knows better, he listens to no one, especially women. And if you are a woman from an external background, even he's going to listen to you even less. He's better when a woman, foreigner or foreign background, comes to tell him something. So you see, the microaggressions of the workplace are conditioned exactly by this epistemological perspective, and this is the core of our conversation. So if one of you guys want to say something, let's go. Otherwise, let's move to the second question and enlarge the other discussion. But please, I want to hear from you.
If I may, just because I spoke first and then so many interesting and wonderful things and important things were said. Yeah, I think what you're all saying is incredibly valid and incredibly important. I think that especially, you know, as somebody who is still very much in academia, but also as somebody who teaches, I've been teaching for the last 3 years as a graduate teaching assistant at King's College in the departments of international development and in war studies. And one of the things as well that I've been constantly trying to do, especially considering how global north focused most examples are, and I always try and introduce case studies of Brazil, which is my specialism, but also South America and West Africa and the African continent as itself, to think about how we can try and shape the minds and help entice the minds of young people at university to seek not only more knowledge, but also to be encouraged to read more. And I wanted to give as well an example, because I think the examples you gave were so enlightening. I wanted to share one of my own, of a case when I was in my first year of teaching as a GTA, as a graduate teaching assistant. We found a plagiarism case. And when I was checking through the essay, I realized that a whole paragraph had been plagiarized from an article written by a South African scholar, which had been published in a more local paper. And the entire paragraph had been plagiarized. And that, to me, felt like such an affront. The idea that somebody who was studying at, you know, what is, you know, essentially one of the most elite universities in the country had not thought to do their own research or go to the library or, you know, seek other material, but had instead chosen to plagiarize from an article written by a scholar from South Africa. And this is something which, you know, I remember commenting to my professor about, and he said, you know, what's sad is that this is something that we are encountering today, but it's something that unless serious action is taken, we may still be encountering 10, 15, 20 years time. And that's something that I think you're absolutely right, Jorge, when you're saying about how maybe more kind of intensive measures may need to be taken as well to kind of enforce more kind of consideration. But also when we think of the education of young children, you know, I remember having grown up in Ladbroke Grove, which you do not know, it's in West London. It's a very multicultural background. And as a child from mixed heritage, my mother's Brazilian, my dad's English, to be surrounded by other young people who, you know, spoke different languages. I grew up bilingually with Portuguese and English, but to also have the opportunity to share stories. And I think as well what Jorge said was really important in terms of how people communicate. And I think this is sometimes where, you know, my grandmother always said, you know, we have 2 ears, but we only have 1 mouth, which means that we need to listen twice as much as we speak. So I think this is something that we all really need to do in our entirety, is start listening more and start, you know, understanding how different people are navigating through life. So yes, I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
And now that you mentioned listening, yes, well, many times if going back to what Lucia mentioned about the service, many times the forms that collect how you feel, etc., are not only so unrelatable, but do not capture subtleties that really inform of the wellness, the well-being, and probably the causal factors of the diseases, right? Diseases that many times are, for example, of occupational origin, are explained as is work life, is work lifestyle. I know of a very close case of a person that has a problem in the back, that has worked in heavy industry in Canada for years, and the doctors keep telling, no, this is not occupational related, it's lifestyle related. Well, 40 years of being an engineer in the field is a lifestyle. So explain that to me, please. No, this is not work related. This is your lifestyle. But the main shaper of the lifestyle is the career. So how come that is not contemplated? That's not part of the diagnostic, right? So this is, for example, another case, another instance of how the subtleties of an epistemological framework that goes to privilege this and that impacts the daily life of people, even their health, even the attention they are entitled or they should be entitled to receive or not. Anyone else?
I just wanted to add something because from what I was thinking, from what Rafia said about her research and the situation in Pakistan, and I was thinking about how the way we internalize whiteness and these things, and how it becomes aspirational for people, and how because of that, a lot of people that are marginalized in many ways start also defending the system and reproducing the system and trying to claw their way up the pyramid in a way. And we see it, well, for people that know Latin America, we talk a lot about mejorar la raza, better the race, the strategy of marrying into white families or lighter skinned families. Fanon speaks of the dream of turning white as well, for example. And I think that's a major component of what's actually destroying a lot of cultures and destroying a lot of communities, and creating a lot of oppression in the global south.
Yes, and in that regard, you are very true in that. Let's see the statistics of how big is the market for blonde hair tint, right? I mean, that is an indication of the white aspiration, but terribly. Yeah. Another one, and we are all guilty, and I am probably the most guilty ever, is try to learn English and speak it perfectly. Of course, we can say, oh, but English is lingua franca. Yes, it has become lingua franca, a language that is a bridge between different cultures. But also there is this connotation, we remember, the one who speaks English better or not feels more complimented, or I don't have that much accent, etc. The glottophobia associated, and how that becomes a marker of whiteness or hegemony. Like if you have if your English has an accent that comes from, let's say, not even UK, Australia or New Zealand, you have a German accent when you speak English, you are in the part of the white spectrum. But if your English has a Spanish accent or a Southeastern accent, or you have an Asian accent, well, you are from somewhere else, the glottophobia. So that is another way that shows, another example who shows how these big frameworks impact our interactions, and the intent of wiping away the accents. There are courses here in Canada and organizations that work to teach you how to speak without an accent. There was a point that I was going to take it because I was eager to get a job and etc. But now I decided to search for a job and caring to keep my accent because is my identity, etc.
I just wanted to comment on what you said about the blonde hint. I think there's actually a really good article by the scholar Tressie Macmillan Cottom about blonde and who gets to be blonde in terms of, if Beyonce colors her hair blonde, she's not really blonde, but so in terms of, again, the aspirational ideal of whiteness and blondness, and also how, we don't really, I think it's so much more important to develop, not more important, but I feel that there's a huge gap in the development of sort of knowledge and discussion around how interpersonal relationships between white and non-white people particularly even I would include like romantic relationships, involve a power balance that is always skewed. I think, this strategy of marrying into whiteness it definitely exists, and it exists in particular here in the United States. And I think that there just isn't as much discussion of how, the sort of even emotional intimacy and sort of rights to be loved and valued as a person are impacted, when people who are of color are in romantic or in other forms of intimate relationships with white people. I think that, I tried to do a little bit of that in Against White Feminism, but I do think that there still is a huge chasm because those interpersonal relationships are not analyzed to the same extent that perhaps structural oppression is talked about. And in that sense, it allows an out for white people and whiteness to be sort of compartmentalized as an abstract sort of discussion, and not something that is impacting people's lives and interpersonal relations constantly, in their everyday lives.
Indeed, indeed. And I think it's time to move to the second question. Thank you very much, Rafia. I also believe, just a little line about that there is another layer of oppression there, which is gender oppression. All the issues that women go through are not really relevant to discuss in public. They either discuss it in private with your shrink, your friends, or don't discuss it at all, right? Keep it to your circle, that's private, right? Yes, that's another layer of oppression in the daily lives set by frameworks, large scale frameworks. And our second question actually hints a bit with gender oppression. The level of socio-political violence deriving from inequalities enabled by those oppressive behaviors that occur in a house, the workplace, and other spaces increase daily and is taking many forms: ethnicity, gender, class, and others. From your perspective, please discuss how to dismantle these structures, aiming to mitigate or extinguish the violence it sparks, because, well, all the violence are rising everywhere, and we are seriously concerned. How could we work at least to mitigate the violence? And now we're going counter-alphabetic, so to give someone else the space and give Maísa more time. So let's start, please, with Rafia.
Okay. The counter, I suppose from an intersectional approach, I don't see, I find the distillation of different kinds of oppression as separate categories to be very troublesome. And this is because as a Muslim woman, I have found that very often there has been this sort of this implicit requirement, and this definitely exists in Canada, actually. In fact, I began my PhD work on, in Ontario, there had been an effort to get Sharia law recognized as the basic, as personal law for arbitration for the people who wanted to choose that route. And that ended up with like the entire Arbitration Act in Ontario being scrapped by the premier. But the point being is that I find that all our, as you described it, layers of identity coalesce in complicated ways, and making a person who occupies different identities, choose or prioritize one over another is just just extremely problematic. And the gender bit that you said in terms of how to sort of, I think you mentioned it right before your question, was that you have to kind of keep that to yourself, and this kind of idea that the personal, there's lots of cute catchphrases like the personal is political and stuff, but when you do bring the personal actually into the political, there is a sort of like almost discomfort with that kind of discussion. And you are disciplined and policed in all sorts of different ways by white people, so that those discussions are not brought into the center of how we understand all of these different oppressions to exist. I've been through it myself, just numerous times. And one thing that I just wanted to throw in there, it's not directly related to your question, is that it almost seems as if the wide experience of privilege and entitlement is the basis on which that entire discourse is ordered, right? So that because white people may not have experience of oppression or direct oppression, or not, I mean that I realize I'm generalizing, but to the same extent as people of color, colonized people, women do, we are sort of talking around the actual issue of oppression, because the demand seems to be that we have to sort of relegate it to this kind of abstract discussion of systems and not that those discussions are not important, of systems and structures, but that the impact of the analysis of systems and structures is like we're not getting the product, because the product ultimately applies individually and interpersonally, and we are not allowed to even discuss that really in so many realms.
Yes, exactly. We're not allowed, and that's one of the largest issues. Jorge, no, sorry, Lucia.
Gracias. I guess I'll continue on the same line, because obviously my focus is on the interpersonal and the individual, obviously thinking about everything at the same time. But I would say, to mitigate some of the damage, I think there's two things that need to happen at the same time. One is support spaces for people who are the most marginalized, and support spaces that allow people to have a little bit of a respite, first of all, from oppression, and then also to develop some critical consciousness and make the links between their own suffering, individual, personal, and the system. To discharge maybe some of that self-blame that tends to happen, some of that shame that tends to happen as well. And if they want to, if they need to organize in find resistance strategies, because there are studies in mental health actually that show that, well, there's this one particular study that says that women that have been victims of gender violence and that develop this critical consciousness and link their own experience to the wider society and oppression have shown a lot more signs of healing in the long term than women that have not made that link. And also, you know, the whole action of resisting and using one's voice and taking action and all of that, it can be very empowering and healing in itself. So first thing is that spaces for marginalized people to find a bit of comfort, a bit of healing, if possible. And the other is, I think what Rafia said is right. We need to start talking a lot more in detail and a lot more bravely and openly about our own internalized oppression and how they play out in our interpersonal relationships, in our groups, in our workplaces, in our teams, and start really questioning what our roles in that are. And I think most people have an active role in it, one way or another, and that's where all the barriers, the psychological resistances that I spoke of a while ago, come in, because it becomes very tough emotionally for people, and that's why I think we need spaces that are specialized for that to accompany people in this process, because it's very tough and also very needed. Yeah, I think that's my answer. There's much more to it, obviously, but yeah, being brave about that.
Time is a tyrant, I know. But yes, visibilizing and giving spaces to respite. Thank you for that. Jorge, please.
Thank you for the question. So let me start by saying the following, right? Charles Mills, in his famous The Racial Contract, starts the introduction, the first line is, white supremacy is the unnamed political system that has made the modern world what it is today, okay? And I think it would be interesting to put that in tandem with Aníbal Quijano's work on José Carlos Mariátegui, where he says, slavery and capitalism existed way before the Europeans arrived to the Americas, but they took a different shape when a new continent was there, moving African and Asian people across the world, goods, etc., and developing a new kind of economic and political system in the world. This system is a white supremacy, right? The ideas of race have not always been the same. We have historically the idea that some races were inferior because they were in Greek, according to Aristotle, you know, the natural slave theory, that all Asians and all non-Athenians or all non-Macedonians would be natural slaves. Anyway, so there was always a racial idea, but the kind of race that we have nowadays, the kind that we have, is tied to this white supremacy system. And it's a product of economic conditions, political conditions, all entangled together. Or if not a product, it's entangled with it. Sorry for that. And if the question is, how do we dismantle those structures? Well, the question, and for all the struggles I have with my Marxist friends, I think that they have a good point, which is that you need a revolution, which doesn't imply that I agree with violence at any sort, but you need a strong revolution. Why? Because you're actually asking, how do we change the structure of the world, right? The world that it is right now is a world of white supremacy. And how do we mitigate sociopolitical violence? Well, you have to change radically living conditions across the world that allow for the subsistence of white supremacy. And as a friend told me, the turkey does not vote for Christmas. So how do you convince white supremacists that still run the planet in Western Europe, North America, to give up their power? Right now, the billionaires are pretending that we live in a simulation, and that's why they can play around with people's lives. They actually believe these things. And they have some philosophers at Oxford and Cambridge that get the support, like racist philosophers, of course, as you do in elite institutions. So I don't know how to mitigate this unless changing things radically. Last time we got a good radical change in humanity was because Europeans killed 100 million people in the world. World War II. After they did all that, they were like, maybe we should start treating humans better. We should be nicer to everybody. But they forgot again. White people forgot again, and now we're in this mess. So I don't know how to mitigate violence when violence is all that there is around us, without dismantling things radically. And if we're gonna do that, I'm always afraid of the casualties, because the casualties in any revolution, even if it's peaceful or not too violent, are gonna end up being the minorities that spark the change. So sorry, as a philosopher, I would go like, I don't know, but I can think of how this might end up.
Well, indeed, that was, I know, it's a very pungent, stinging, challenging, and almost impossible question. But I think our minds, we can at least open the dialogue about that. And you're very right. Your skepticism is welcome, Jorge, because that was the question was, how can we do this safely? Because at the end, who's going to pay, like we say in Peru, who's going to pay the broken dishes? The most vulnerable, right? And now we go, please, with Maísa.
Thank you. Yeah, amazing. I mean, it's given me so many things to think about. I've made a couple of notes just to kind of help me structure my thoughts, because I was listening so intently. I wanted to pick up on something that Lucia said that I thought, Lucia, sorry, I spent some time in Italy last year, and I keep thinking Lucia instead of Lucia, my apologies. Lucia, when it comes to thinking about questioning our roles, I wanted to kind of latch onto that. I thought that was really poignant. And, when it comes to thinking about one's role, I think that the prompt was, incredibly accurate in saying, where you have a role changes often in the space in which you inhabit. So the role that you may play in your family could be different to the role that you play at home, which could be different from the role that you play in your workplace, which could be different from the role you play in wider society. Because although you are you, the position that you may hold, even in, different groups, may shift, right? Where you could be a person that is well regarded in one sector, you could be somebody who is incredibly ignorant in another. Or even, for me, I guess, as a cis white woman, I am, I guess in a different position in a lot of ways to thinking about where I would fall in a social hierarchy. But although I am white, I am also a woman. And in that regard, I feel like when it comes to thinking of role and how one should question their role, I think that's incredibly important. But it should also make us question, what we have in terms of ourselves. Because one of the things that I think is crucial, and what you were saying about speaking and having spaces for people to dialogue, I think that's absolutely a very important practice to have, because as we speak, we are sharing not only our thoughts, but we're sharing potentially our feelings and also sharing experiences. And I think it's really through, people being able to listen and learn that hopefully we will see change, even if it's, that idea of, I mean, especially for us as IR scholars, we always think of, the local, the regional, the continental, the global, you think about it in kind of tiers. So if you could, even change the mind or persuade somebody that you just met in the street, or somebody that in your workplace, or somebody that you interact with on a regular basis, such as a family member, to me, when I think of change, and I think, a revolution would be glorious if it were conducted, obviously, in a way that, led to positive change. But again, we could go down a rabbit hole of thinking, what is change? Who would it benefit? How would that work? But in terms of thinking, of making change, I think if we are able to reduce inequality in even our own surroundings, and then if that person who feels like they are learning something could then also try and inspire others. You know, if we are you know, the idea of throwing a stone into a pond of water and you see the ripples sort of widen, I think the same idea applies, that before we often try and spark something in the world, we need to do something about our local surroundings. And that is where each person has a role, and each community has a role to think about how they're going to, I don't know, maybe share more of their experiences or how that might work. So when it comes to, I guess, the UK, you know, as the country where I grew up, one of the things that is thankfully being spoken a lot more about, especially in the university sector, is thinking about how we can work to not only decolonize the curriculum, but also think about inclusivity and asking ourselves, who are we reading? You know, we look at those reading lists in course curriculum and think, who are we reading? And you're absolutely right. You see the names and you think, well, there might be a, you know, Maikowski, but is Maikowski from Poland, or is he, you know, from, maybe he's Canadian, maybe he's, you know, Brazilian, maybe he's Argentine. You know, Makovsky could be the descendant of a Pole that has gone all sorts of different places. So this is where we still need to think about how messages travel and how education, you know, is a system that I absolutely agreed with what was said earlier in terms of education has a lot of limits in the way in which often enough you do see predominantly white scholars on the reading lists, and that we do need to see change. But I also think that when it comes to making the change, I absolutely agree with what Jorge said, that we need to have conversations with with communities that are underrepresented. And what you were saying earlier about how, you know, that you're at a conference and you were speaking about Indigenous rights, and they made, you know, these incredibly derogatory remarks about the Indigenous people of the region, and you think, well, you know, that's unacceptable. They shouldn't have it. The fact that that even mentality still existed is again proof that we have so much more work to be done. And I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Well, we're gonna enter the part of the discussion. The last part of the discussion before we go to questions and answers. I just wanted to mention two things in relation to all what you're saying. Yes, I remember this fantastic author, Cynthia Cockburn, a radical feminist. She calls the whole planetary system a phallocracy. And this phallocracy is composed, yeah, I love the word too, is composed by the marrying, the interwoven of the interests of gender, males, ethnicity, which is background, and income. Ethnicity is background, and religion, and income, which is capitalism. So these three things sort of conflate or kind of go in cahoots together to establish a certain order that at the end is going to serve power and profit. And in the way to configure the power and profit, in a way, it is going to allocate credibility, agency, and roles, right? So that is how, for example, the discussions that happen to minorities, LGBTQ, women, indigenous, etc., are less relevant than the structures or the money. No, that is we have to care for the system, and that is how, for example, these guys, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, have the power now. That we could say that, yeah, the royalty exists, but the new royalty is capital, is the large, the limitless capital, and they have a saying on many things. And well, with that, I'd like to kick the last part of the discussion. Please go ahead.
Can I?
Jorge, go, please, go. Open your mic. Let's go.
Yeah, I was going to share the story that when I started in the job market, you know, when I was looking for a job as a professor, as a philosophy professor, I was recommended by colleagues, really well-meaning colleagues, not to mention in philosophy departments that Kant was a racist, because a lot of philosophers get offended by that and they get triggered. A lot of white male philosophers, they don't want to hear that. Right? There was currently a debate about, like, why is this ideology attacking Kant in philosophy Twitter a couple of, like, this week or last week, Like, oh, these ideas, these new ideas as thing can, his alleged racism shouldn't be up for consideration. We just care about his epistemology. We're like, he wrote a book, like a whole piece, ranking races, explaining why most of non-white people were not humans because they couldn't achieve proper rational capacity. But we don't talk about that. And I was suggested not to, my recommendation I was given was, don't mention this to white people. They get super triggered. You're not gonna get a job.
Yeah,
like,
well, I'm gonna add like my bit of that. Mine was in my book. I've written about how Simone de Beauvoir was racist, and oh my God, it's the same exact reaction. Like, I mean, that whole piece has been. I mean, and the fact is, like, there's nothing they can do because there's plenty of textual evidence, direct textual evidence for it. But yeah, they get very, very, white women get very, very triggered if someone says Simone de Beauvoir was racist. Yeah.
So at the end of the day, there seems to be this idea that we have to protect the feelings of the white people because
yes.
and there's I mean, the suggestion I got was well intended. Why they were like, you're not gonna get a proper job if you start engaging with them at this level. I was like, fair enough. I didn't brought that in my first talk because I wasn't, it wasn't necessarily relevant to the topic. I was explaining indigenous epistemologies in my job interviews. But of course, the first talk I gave as a professor was like, well, I was told not to say this. And when I was in the job market, now I'm a professor, so you're gonna hear me out. And it's about, what I like about philosophy is that I have a carte blanche to just make people uncomfortable. And it's like, it just comes with the territory, right? So I'm running with that. But there's something about to be said about how the institutions that we're talking about, universities, also play into the capitalist mindset that serves certain interests. And there's a lot of talk about EDI, decolonization, etc. I was visiting a scholar at Cambridge, and they had a pamphlet when I was there, like a small ad saying, we have 20 new Black students, a success for Cambridge. I was like, are you freaking kidding me? Like, you abuse the Caribbean so long. So many African countries were abused by you, and you're like I think it's between 4 and 6% of the population of England is Black, and they're like, we have 20 Black students in the university. We're a success. You should be ashamed. There's a lot of instrumentalization of these discussions to make white people feel better about themselves. And I think we should start, if we're going to decolonize university, we should start just being like, no, that's stupid. You should not be proud that you have 20 Black students. You should be saying, I'm sorry, I only have 20 Black students, right? I went to a council meeting in my university in Alberta a few days ago, and I said, it is an aberration that we don't have a single graduate student that is indigenous in the philosophy department. We'll have to do with, we're talking about retention of undergraduate students. Yes, that is a big problem, agree. But if we don't train doctoral students from underrepresented groups, then we're not going to have the critical mass of professors to change the mindset at the university or policy level. Sorry, I could go on, and I get
this is something. Oh, yeah. No, this is something very true. It's like the presence of women in boards and the presence of CEO women. There is a statistic that says there are more CEOs that have the name Michael than CEOs that are women in Canada. There are only 6 female CEOs and 8 CEOs called Michael. So we are that minoritarian. However, also the workforce is only 35% female. And while the number of female managers have grown up, has increased, still there is not enough. And many research, specifically a piece conducted by a company, CM Research, which is British, but the guy used to work in Peru. I worked with him for a while. They demonstrate that numerical superiority does not lead to equality. Actually increases the male bullying and the sexual harassment and the workplace gender-based violence. So it's unbelievable, the resistance. And I'm sorry, Jorge, Abraham, Zeno, and Francesco, I'm sorry, but the resistance from males is as bad as the self, how can I say, the self-care of whiteness. Yeah, don't offend the white. I went through a very bad episode of workplace sexual harassment. And I was told, don't you see you're damaging your coworker by raising this accusation without proof? What do you think I can have a picture or a video of this? If I video or picture him harassing me, number one, you're going to see a guy talking to a woman. You're not going to see the whole thing. Second, I can go to jail for recording or taking a picture of a public servant in a public service building, in a government building. So no, I don't have, excuse me, I don't have hard evidence of this. So this is a way, right? How the oppression and who gets the credibility, who gets to tell the story, and who gets to be allocated. You are right. This is factual. This is anecdotal. This is an imagination of yours. And ergo, who is going to tell who in a classroom? Because this carry on, it's a continuum. And this is part of what Cynthia Cockburn called the phallocracy. The phallocracy entices a continuum of violence. And with that spark, I want to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that in. You know, what we tend to think of as white fragility, I don't really like that concept. So white people are not fragile, they're violent in their reactions. But, you know, just people know what I'm talking about because that's the known word for it. Yeah, so I think there's a lot more, as you say, work to do on that. There's a lot of responsibility to be taken by white people. And I want to give perhaps the example of white women specifically, again, to bring out a subject that makes people prickly, because that's what I do. White women tend to get very defensive when they are told that they are oppressive. And they turn the conversation around their own oppression, you know, so gender oppression exclusively, when the question of race and ethnicity comes up, and is a very often happens very, very often. And this all sorts of kind of meltdowns that happen, emotional and psychological and weird dynamics. And I think my point is, if we want to start addressing this in ourselves and around us, this is the first thing that we need to start addressing. These dynamics and these internal defenses for white women, perhaps, to ask ourselves, because I consider myself white mestiza, what's going on? Why am I reacting like this? And it's curious, because what I said earlier, I don't know if it was kind of heard like I proposed discussion spaces, but I wasn't proposing a discussion or a listening space. I was proposing a very hardworking space, psychologically and emotionally, where people come and get very uncomfortable and distressed. That's what I do. I'm a therapist, so that wouldn't faze me. I know a lot of people are not used to that, but I think this is part of the process. I think people need to feel a little bit of pain, privileged people, and not conflate distress and discomfort with harm. It's not the same. You're just feeling distress and discomfort because you're facing and confronting your own oppressive side, the side that you don't like about yourself, that you don't want to see. Yeah, just to clarify.
Thank you for saying that, and that's very true, because number one, white and non-white. While there is there are groups that fight to protect the white supremacy, I would like all of them to take a DNA test and show me that they are 100% white. That doesn't exist, but has become a truth. It's something. There's an author that said this is something that doesn't exist but exists, right? Science has proved that race is pretty much almost an inexistent object. However, it's still true and regulates, organizes society, as Mariela Noles Cotito, who couldn't be here, said recently in an interview. No? Race is an organizer of society, while it doesn't exist. So when we talk about oppression, of course, we talk about a strong and clear pattern of white supremacy, white superiority, and phallocracy. Yes, Cynthia Cockburn Dixit. But also we talk about internal oppression too, internalized oppression and self-oppression. So this is the richness, I believe, of our discussion and what I would like us to bring to the debate. No? All this fantastic set of panelists to put out as a memory of this event. Because it's not just the political part, it's not just the structure, it's mostly the intimate, because when you internalize that, that's when it is perpetuated, right? I want to hear from everyone, please.
I just want to chime in and what Lucia said about white fragility being a bad term. I think you're right. I think 100% right. It's like, it's not white fragility, it's the possibility of the white backlash, what we are facing. Like if you say something that upsets white people, they're not gonna get sad or depressed. You might just not get the job that they are holding out from you, right? Even if you're the more qualified candidate, the most qualified candidate. So yeah, I think that's a completely valid point, and I just wanted to thank Lucia for pointing that out.
Well, all these things reflect in daily interactions. We see that, for example, there are countries that you have to send a picture with your resume and specify if you're married, if you're single, your age. And while in other places, for example, in Canada, you don't have to disclose your age, your marital status, or even your background. You don't have to send a picture. Still, there is always a way to find out, right? I know from anecdotal cases that happened to me and other people that, for example, in an interview, you're asked why someone so experienced wants to work in this entry level. That is saying, I'm trying to hire a young person and you're too old for me, right? Or why you know in so many languages, why don't you go and teach? So, okay, thank you. Thank me for applying, please, but don't tell me what to do, right? Is this thing that I've been told, you're a Latina, why don't you open your daycare? You guys are good with children. Please bring me your children. Let me show you what can you do to your children, please. Things like that, right? And this is patterns that are part of society, part of our culture, and we are educated into that. There is a manual for nurses that talks about how the diseases and the symptomatology works across the races. And this is an actual book that is used in the faculties of nursing today in North America, not only in Canada, US, and maybe in other parts of the Commonwealth. I'm not sure if you guys have come across to that.
I would like just to mention this this goes back, also connects to what you're saying now, and goes back to the reference you made to the idea from Mariela Noles about race not being real. I think that the term we could use is race is a social construct, and the same as gender, right? And a lot of people tend to conflate biological elements with social constructs, and they forget that a lot of biology is informed by social cultural practices. That includes notions of sex, race, skin, etc., right? And people are like, oh, but if it's a social contract, it's not actually real. I was like, well, money is a social contract, and you're pretty much needed to eat, right? So we should not disregard the value of these things, of course, for organizing society, as was said before. And I was reminded of the case of this med student in the UK who recently wrote the first book to determine skin conditions in Black people, because all the dermatologists that had written books that wrote books in the UK were white, so they were not able to determine skin conditions in people of color, which was like, sounds about white, right? it's just how it goes. So there's all these concepts. I am always, because I teach epistemology and there's sections about scientific knowledge that are worth discussion. When people put too much credence in biology and exact science, I'm always like, we need to go back to the basics and let's discuss. A lot of how science is taught in universities might just be replicating certain prejudices. Like phrenology was a science, right? The University of Edinburgh had one of the most important phrenology departments in the world. And according to phrenology, I probably should be in a prison and not in a university setup.
Definitely. Well, we can take questions as we continue discussing. If anyone has questions, please. And in any case, yes. I was going to say something related to what Jorge said, and I just forgot it. Please, Maísa, Rafia, Lucia, I would like to hear from you.
Thank you. I've been more listening and thinking in terms of kind of adding to the discussion. I don't know what to add, only because I feel like I have so much still to kind of think about and to digest. And but in terms of kind of next steps, I think we should definitely do another one of these. I think it would be fabulous, and I think it would be really amazing to even if we were to transform it into a sort of like workshop or something, to have maybe some activities or something, just in terms of being able to get a flavor as well of what audience might think or see, or but in terms of thinking of all that we've been discussing this evening, I feel like when we have conversations, I feel like often enough people almost just there's often it depends. If sometimes people will say what they think that other people want to hear, if that makes sense. So sometimes I feel like people often create their own echo chambers, in terms of we often are in echo chambers, especially through kind of algorithms of apps or whatever, that we get fed information to kind of foster whatever it is that we are thinking. But often enough, I think we build our own echo chambers, depending on the audience that people are with. They kind of sometimes tailor what they're saying to kind of fit what that audience may or may not think. And that is obviously a form as well of self-censorship and thinking of how people can express themselves. I think one of the attitudes I've always tried to take in the classroom, especially if a student says something that I disagree with, is very much just thinking, well, okay, this person has said something that I profoundly disagree with, or they are saying something that I think hasn't been carefully thought out. And if they do, I say, well, okay, why do you think that? How can you defend that? Where are you positioning yourself to have reached this position? And that then leads to, from what I've at least witnessed, either a retraction and be like, oh, it's just what my dad said, or oh, it's just what I heard. And it's like, well, okay, so this is not necessarily your opinion. This is something that you've been told or has led to you having this position. But then again, you have some students who have read widely, or have tried to read widely, and as they try and construct why they think something, you see how they, as at 18, 19 or 20-year-olds, have tried to reach that thought, and you see this kind of rather convoluted chain of connections that they made to kind of reach a position. And when it comes to our own thinking, I'm sure we're all guilty of overthinking. We often get into little spirals of thinking, well, how is this linked to this, and how does that? But when it comes to allowing ourselves to be receptive to new information or anything new that we learn, I think that I'm sure Lucia, as somebody who works with mental health, will probably have some great advice on this. But just thinking how we can learn to be more receptive as, you know, a people, you know, or as a community, or as an individual? How to learn to be more receptive, how to kind of open your ears, you know, as we're harking back to what I said, that, you know, my grandmother said in terms of having 2 ears and 1 mouth. How do we have those ears sort of primed in the best possible way to listen, and, you know, listen before just kind of going, well, just like blurting out something, which is something that often enough we see a lot. And I think, you know, the comments that were made, especially with regard to, especially, I guess, white women being kind of defensive or being reactive. Yeah, in a lot of cases, absolutely. I've definitely been in conversations with people about all sorts of different topics, especially, you know, with regard to, so we'll take the case of Brazil. You know, Brazil has, you know, 51%, I believe it's now, of the population that identifies as Black. You know, and you think, well, this is a country that has an incredibly complex past. But if you say to some especially wealthy white families in Brazil that Brazil has a huge racist issue, they're like, what are you talking about? This is so multiracial. And you think, well, hang on a second. Let's go back 2 or 3, 4, 5, 10 steps, and let's kind of go through this, you know, carefully. So yeah, that's just kind of where I was kind of going in terms of my my kind of train. But no, thank you guys so much for all you've said. It's been really amazing. Thank you.
I think we all have to thank all of us, each other. And Carlota has a question. Please, Carlota.
I do, actually. So first of all, thank you for a very thought-provoking debate. I've actually been having a question since the very beginning, so now it's my time to let it out for Rafia. It's just like I haven't read your book yet. I am planning to, Against White Feminism, and I was just curious to ask you, of course, this is probably a very long conversation, but just in a couple of minutes, like, what's the argument of the book, and what do you think white feminists in general get wrong about non-white feminists, and in what ways are they sort of undermining their cause instead of helping it? And what do you think it takes for the two to collaborate and work together?
Okay, yes, that is a very long conversation, but I suppose to put it in a nutshell, my objectives with the book it could be summarized into 2 parts. One is, of course, to show that whiteness exists as a system of entitlement and privileges and beliefs that center the concerns and priorities and identities of white people. So not, I'm not talking about race as a biological or like, your race as your actual color, although obviously most white feminists are in fact white. But it is entirely possible for there to be Black and brown, Asian white feminists, in that it reflects a commitment to continue to center whiteness and the concerns of white women, power, privileges. So that's one part. It is my belief, or in the book, that the problem that I was confronted with is that post the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly the war in Afghanistan, where feminism was used as this sort of a cover story to hide what were purely strategic imperatives of the United States and sort of the desire for revenge post 9/11, is that indigenous feminisms within the Muslim world in particular were almost completely delegitimized, because feminism, or even just empowerment in general, was considered a base, like to be talking about those terms was equivocated with acting white and being white and sort of identifying with whiteness, which was also at that time an occupying force. So the question for me was that how can I at least begin to give a language to not brown, Black, Asian feminists, so that they can re-legitimize their indigenous feminisms. And the answer that I came up with was that if it is at all possible to excise whiteness from feminism, then feminism can actually be a unifying collective force once again. But of course, in order to do the excision of whiteness, I had to tell the story of feminism from tell the history of feminism as deeply inflected with colonial beliefs and racist ideas and starting with the fact, for instance, that it's, the story of feminism that's told in terms of the waves, the first wave, second wave, begins with the white suffragist movement and their struggle of white suffragists for the vote, when long before that, women, and during that time, brown women, for instance, in India, were facing the bullets of British soldiers as they were taking part in the anti-colonial struggle against the British. So, and these were women's movements that were doing that. They were and I mean, that's just one example, but there are numerous examples of women fighting collectively for against colonialism, against oppression, long before the suffragist movement. So, but the point being, and the story that I like to tell is that after British women won the vote in the UK, they were so excited and enthused that they had done this, that a group of them went to India and started to tell Indian women that, you need to fight for the vote too, because you deserve the vote. And, and they would go on and on and on. But Indian women weren't interested. And ultimately, one of them told the British women, hey, look, I don't want to be equal to the brown man over here, because both him and I are enslaved by you. What I want is for you to leave, and then I will have the vote and India will be independent. And I present that, I mentioned that example because the sad thing is it's still the case, white women will say all these sorts of things within Black, brown, Asian contexts without any realization whatsoever how idiotic they are and how little they are willing to acknowledge the oppression and continuing ravaging that they are producing. And it's in light of this discussion, I suppose, like the last thing I would say is that it's exhausting, because it's almost like if you don't play the grateful brown feminist all the time, grateful to white women for giving us the leftovers of whatever they don't want, it is it is an existence of constant gaslighting and constant sort of having to reiterate your position over and over and over again, and then still, for instance, see that the chair of the minority studies departments are white women, the, people teaching again, like, about even the critique of white feminism. I realize I've written a book, but like often white women feel absolutely no level of self-consciousness in saying, in even insisting that they will teach the critique of their own problems, because it's like I said, people say a lot of things, but in the end, the solutions are ceding space and allowing other people to speak, and that is where there hasn't been hardly any progress at all, because by and large, it is still white people, white women, speaking for all of feminism, and not, not realizing how they have become oppressors of a different kind next to white men. So, yeah.
Yes, certainly. Thank you very much for that. Do we have more questions or
Can
more
I add
interventions?
something?
Yes, please,
just
go
to
ahead.
kind of
Yes, go ahead.
answer
Go ahead.
one of the things that Maísa said at the end, because I think is really interesting, her question about helping people be more open to things like this. And I thought of something, I remembered something. We know that, I think what you're doing, Maísa, with students is really good, because being curious about them and their reactions and their thoughts first is a really good way of opening the space to introduce new thinking later. And one of the experiences I had a while ago with another therapist who was running a workshop for white therapists about whiteness and racism, he modeled that very, very well, I think, because there was a very tough presentation about the realities of racist violence. And sometimes, at times, people would react to that saying, well, this is really painful, I can't bear this, I'm really distressed. And his response would be something like, I understand what you're feeling, I empathize with what you're feeling, and your feelings are valid, you can react that way to seeing distressing things, but this is not about you. This is not about your feelings. This is about the harm that people racialized as other endure. So this movement of giving a little bit of space to them and then decentering from their feelings and their reactions, it's really useful to kind of help people regulate while they learn how to decenter from their own reactions, especially white people, because we're not used to that in this society, to be honest. So yeah, with the caveat, obviously, that I think it's great to be aware of the context as well, and who else is present in the room and who can be actually harmed by giving space to that.
Thank you very much. Very insightful.
Okay. I know we're about to, like, at the end of this, I just want to point out that this is an Italian institution, right, Verona?
Yes,
and
ITSS
I want to take the opportunity just to mention that let's not forget that Italy also had colonies in North and East Africa. Italy also has a past of colonization, right? So it's not exempt from it. And it's always useful to bring that back to the conversation. This is a global issue. And racism is connected to that, gender oppression is connected to that, like how Black players are treated in Italy is well known. So just to point out, we're talking about an Italian institution. There's a lot to point out in any part of the world. Let's not forget that Italy is also part of the problem. Even though a lot of times Europeans don't think racism is real. I've noticed that a lot with Dutch academia, English, and Italy. They're like, we don't have that problem. They're like, oh boy, you don't have that problem when you don't know your history. When you forget your history, yeah, you don't have a racism problem. But yes, I thought it was valid to point it out.
Thank you very much. And yeah, certainly it's valid. It's a planetary issue that has wrapped up and articulates diverse ways to oppress others, right? Gender, class, education, etc. Yes, yes. And with those final remarks, unless there is another comment or another question, I'll give the floor to Carlota to close the event.
Thank you, Julia, for a beautiful event, and thanks to you all as well for being here. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think it really needs another webinar to develop more solutions and more ideas. Just one last thing I wanted to say, Michele Groppi, the president of ITSS, will not be here tonight because of some commitments, but he does say hi to each of you, and he wants to thank all of you, and he really appreciates your presence here. And once again, it was really great discussing this. I think we need more discussions like this, but we start with one step at a time. But I think it's something that we need more in the future. And thank you, Julia, again for organizing this with me.
Thank you, Carlota. Thank you, all of you. You guys are wonderful, and I look forward to have more of these events, discussions, maybe writings, keynotes, etc.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay.
Good night to everybody.
Before I forget, once again.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to show this again.
I think you got to go back with your arrow. Go back. Yeah, there. Well, this webinar has been recorded, as you know, and it's going to be available whenever, I mean, after it's converted, etc. It will be uploaded soon enough, and we will share with you. You can post it in all your networks, and it to everybody. It's going to be free access, open source.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, guys. Have a good evening. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Take care.
Good day to all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Been
Thank
great.
you. Bye, Franco.
Bye.
Chica, stop the recording.